50,000 soldiers, 100 guns, a wedge of land between two rivers. This is not how you want to meet the enemy when you have 9,000 men and 17 cannons. But on September 23rd, 1803, Audacious, a 34-year-old British officer, rode to a ridge above the village of Assaye in western India and saw exactly that. Arthur Wellesley, not yet the Duke of Wellington, not yet the man who would break Napoleon, just a major general with a decision to make. Attack now with a force 5 times smaller, or watch the Marathas slip away. He attacked. 3 hours later, 1,600 of his men were dead or wounded. The Maratha army was shattered, 98 enemy guns captured. And Wellesley would spend the rest of his life calling Assaye the bloodiest fight he ever saw, even after Waterloo. The question is not why he won. The question is how 9,000 British and Indian troops walked into the mouth of 100 cannons and came out holding the field. The answer sits in the mud of the Kaitna River, in the discipline of men who marched through grapeshot, and in a bayonet charge so brutal that Maratha gunners died loading their pieces. This is not about tactics. This is about men who refused to break when everything said they should. Start in October 1802. Battle of Pune. Yashwant Rao Holkar, chief of Indore, crushes the combined armies of Daulat, Rao Scindia, and Peshwa Baji Rao II. The Peshwa, nominal overlord of the Maratha Confederacy, flees his capital, rides to Bassein, a coastal fort held by the British East India Company. December 31st, 1802, he signs a treaty, the Treaty of Bassein. Terms are simple and devastating. Accept British troops on Maratha soil, cedi territory worth 2.6 million rupees annually. Give up all claims to tribute from Hyderabad. Let the company arbitrate disputes. Never employ Europeans from nations at war with Britain. Let the British control foreign relations. This treaty was the death knell. Scindia of Gwalior and Bhonsle of Nagpur saw it as surrender. An insult to Maratha honor. By August 1803, they had united their forces and crossed the Narmada River. War was inevitable. Lord Mornington, the ambitious Governor-General, seized the moment. His younger brother Arthur led the Southern Army. 24,000 men total when fully assembled, 4,500 available immediately. The mission: restore the Peshwa to Pune, crush Scindia and Bhonsle in the Deccan, while General Lake handled the north. August 8th, 1803. Wellesley breaks camp. Marches on Ahmednagar, takes the walled town by escalade the same day. The fort surrenders August 12th after artillery breaches the wall. 2 killed, 5 wounded. Control extends south to the Godavari River. The pursuit begins. The Maratha army was not what European commanders expected from Indian forces. 10,800 regular infantry, organized in 3 brigades, trained by European mercenary officers, armed with muskets and bayonets, supported by over 100 guns with trained crews. Add 30 to 40,000 irregular cavalry. This was a modern army. Colonel Anthony Pullman commanded the largest brigade, 8 battalions. A Hanoverian, former British East India Company sergeant, deserted 1792 or 1793, joined Scindia's service, rose to captain by 1794, battalion command by 1795, promoted to colonel 1799. By 1803, he effectively commanded all regular Maratha battalions after Scindia, and the Raja of Berar left the field before battle. Another brigade. 5 battalions belonged to Begum Samru, commanded by a Frenchman, Colonel Jean Saleur. European expertise, European discipline, European firepower. The Marathas had learned from their defeats and hired the best. Wellesley pursued for weeks. His army and a smaller force under Colonel James Stevenson, where 10,000 men were supposed to converge before any major engagement. Intelligence was spotty, maps unreliable. The monsoon made rivers flood and movement difficult, exactly as Wellesley had planned. Flooding rivers hindered the fast-moving Maratha cavalry. September 21st, intelligence arrives. The Maratha encampment sits near Borkardin, between the Kalna River and its tributary, the Jua, 5 miles away, not 3 days away. Wellesley makes a choice. Attack immediately or lose them. Stevenson is too far to join. The odds are brutal. 50,000 Marathas with over 100 guns against 4,500 infantry, a few cavalry squadrons, and 17 guns. Any rational commander waits for reinforcements. Wellesley was not rational. He was aggressive. He believed the Maratha army would move if given time. He wanted to prove himself. His advancement had been attributed to his brother being Governor-General. Jealous rivals whispered nepotism. He needed a victory that spoke for itself. September 23rd, 1803. Morning. Wellesley leaves a battalion of sepoys at Nalnia to guard baggage and marches with the rest. Around 11 o'clock, He expects to find the Marathas the next day. Then scouts report the enemy is 5 miles ahead. He orders the small force guarding camp fortified and moves forward with everyone else. 4,500 infantry, 19 the light dragoons, 3 squadrons of Madras Native Cavalry, 5,000 Mysore and Maratha irregular horse, 22 guns. Though only 17 would cross the river, 1 in the afternoon. Wellesley rides ahead with a cavalry escort to reconnoiter, tops a ridge, sees the Maratha army spread below, miles of soldiers, over 100 guns, infantry in line, cavalry masses on the flanks. The village of Assaye sits north of the Jua. Pipulgan and Warur sit on opposite banks of the Kaitna, beyond the Maratha left. If you value documented military history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from War History's December 20-24 publication, Assaye 1803, which details battlefield archaeology, and eyewitness accounts from John Blakiston's Madras Army records, and Wikipedia's comprehensive Battle of Assaye article updated 1 month ago, cross-referencing British regimental records, Maratha command structures, and casualty figures from both Wellesley's dispatches and modern historical estimates. Now back to the information. Pullman had positioned his army defensively. Infantry line facing south behind the steep banks of the Kaitna, guns arrayed directly in front, Maratha cavalry on the right, Berar's irregular infantry garrisoning Assaye to the rear, only one obvious ford. Directly ahead of the Maratha position, a killing ground. Funnel the British across into cannon fire. Then infantry and cavalry finish them. Wellesley's guides said no other ford existed. He ignored them, noticed the 2 villages, Pipulgan and Warur, one on each bank beyond the Maratha left. Villages meant people. People meant crossing points. He sent his chief engineer, Captain John Johnson, to scout. Johnson found a ford, 3 in the afternoon. The British cross, unopposed except distant Maratha cannon fire, mostly inaccurate. One shot decapitates Wellesley's dragoon orderly. The man's head flies off as they wade through the water. Wellesley keeps moving. Once across, he orders 6 infantry battalions into 2 lines, cavalry as reserve in a third. Allied Maratha and Mysore cavalry stay south of the Kaitna to check enemy cavalry hovering near the British rear. Pullman reacts, swings his entire force 90 degrees, establishes a new line approximately 1 mile across the isthmus, right flank on the Kaitna, left on Assaye. The redeployment is swift, efficient, European-trained discipline. Wellesley extends his own front to prevent outflanking, orders the 74th Highlanders and a battalion of pickets to move obliquely right. This allows the 78th Highlanders to anchor the left. 4 Madras infantry battalions form the center. The 1st 10th, 1st 8th, 1st 4th, and 2nd 12th, Madras Native Infantry. The Madras pioneers support them. The armies face each other. British line 1,400 yards long, Maratha line 1 mile. Over 100 Maratha guns against 17 British. The odds in artillery are 6-1. In infantry, worse. In cavalry, the disparity is crushing. Wellesley orders his artillery forward to duel the Maratha guns. Disaster. British cannon are outmatched. The mass firepower of Maratha artillery disables them quickly. Weight of shot tears through British gun crews. Maratha cannonade intensifies, turns on the infantry, grape shot, chain shot, round shot. The killing field Pullman intended. British casualties mount, men fall in ranks. Gaps open. The choice is stark: stay and die under artillery, retreat and lose, or charge into the guns. Wellesley orders the advance. Abandon the cannon, fix bayonets, march forward into the mouth of the Maratha guns. No other option exists. The only way to survive the artillery is to take the artillery. The British and Madras infantry march. Maratha cannonade punches holes in the line. Men fall. The line closes up, keeps moving. Steady pace. European drill on an Indian battlefield. The 78th Highlanders lead on the left. Kilts replaced by thin linen trousers for the Indian heat. Red jackets, feather bonnets, brown Bess muskets. Effective range 100 yards. Fired in volleys. Bayonets 17 inches of steel. The Madras battalions march beside them. Sepoys, Indian soldiers trained by the British, disciplined, armed identically, red jackets and breeches. They have fought before, they know what's coming. Distance closes. Maratha guns fire continuously, canister at close range, dozens of musket balls in each shot. Scything through ranks, the British keep coming. 50 yards from the guns, 40, 30, 20. The 78th halts, 50 yards out, fires a massive volley, smoke and flame. Maratha gunners fall. Then the Highlanders charge, bayonets fixed, running now, screaming. The shock of close quarters combat. The Marathas had not expected this. Most armies break under sustained cannonade. These men charge through it. The gunners stand their ground. Brave men. Many die loading their pieces. Bayonets find them in the act. Others hide under guns. Jump up to attack with pikes. Sepoys cut them down. John Blakiston, an officer in the Madras army, records it later. Nothing could surpass the skill or bravery displayed by the Maratha gunners. They fought to the death. The 4 Madras battalions reached Pullman's line moments later. Same tactic, volley at close range, bayonet charge. The gunners die. The infantry keep pushing. The Maratha right infantry battalions massed behind the guns does not meet the charge. They break, flee north toward the Jua. The rest of the southern half follows. The sepoys, encouraged by success, push too far. Discipline wavers. Officers lose control temporarily. Maratha cavalry threatens to charge. The 78th, still in order, reforms to face them, checks the threat. The sepoys regroup. On the northern sector, catastrophe. Lieutenant Colonel William Orrock commands the pickets, misinterprets orders, continues oblique movement directly toward Assaye. Major Samuel Swinton of the 74th Regiment follows to support, creates a massive gap in the center of the British line. Both battalions come under barrage from guns around Assaye and the Maratha left. Heavy fire, canister, and round shot at point-blank range. The 2 battalions fall back in disarray. Pullman orders his remaining infantry and cavalry forward to attack. The Marathas give no mercy. The pickets are nearly annihilated. The 74th forms a rough square behind piles of dead bodies, ramparts of corpses. They hold barely. Wellesley sees his right flank collapsing. If it breaks, the army is exposed, flanked, destroyed. He orders Colonel Patrick Maxwell to charge with British cavalry, the 19th Light Dragoons and Madras Native Cavalry. Maxwell leads them forward. Like a torrent that had burst its banks, one witness writes, the cavalry smashes into the Maratha infantry and horsemen, drives them back, saves the 74th, but the battle is not done. Maratha gunners who had feigned death when the British advanced now reman their guns, turn them on the rear of the 74th and Madras infantry. Cannon fire into backs. Wellesley orders his 4 sepoy battalions to reform, ward off Maratha infantry and cavalry, sends the 78th back to retake the gun line. Wellesley himself gallops to the 7th Madras Native Cavalry, held in reserve to the east, leads a cavalry charge personally from the opposite direction, 2-pronged attack on the guns. The gunners stand again, brave to the end, eventually driven from their pieces, this time ensure all who remain are dead. No more surprises. While Wellesley retakes the guns, Pullman rallies his infantry, regroups them into a semicircle, backs to the Jua, right flank across the river. Left in Assaye, the Maratha army is not finished. Wellesley's infantry reorganizes, wary of the Maratha cavalry still hovering to the west. Thousands of horsemen, unused in the battle so far, a threat that could sweep the exhausted British if given an opening. The British must finish this before fatigue makes them vulnerable. Maxwell's cavalry charges again, this time met with heavy fire, driven off. The British and Madras infantry attack on foot, march forward again, fix bayonets again. The Marathas retreat across the Jua. The irregulars manning Assaye flee. The Maratha cavalry, seeing the infantry retreat, melts away. The battle is won. 3 hours, start to finish. The cost is staggering. Of 6,000 British and Indian troops engaged, close to 1,600 are killed or wounded. Over a quarter of the force, the 74th Highlanders suffer worst. 500 men at the start, 168 killed, 295 wounded. 40 men answer when Wellesley calls for them after the battle. Only 40 can stand. The rest are down. Sir? They are all down, comes the reply. The British army assumed the 74th was destroyed, expected the wounded to die in the tropical heat. Infection killed most wounded soldiers, but the Highlanders recovered, nearly all of them. 2 months later, the 74th fights at Argum. The regiment's resilience becomes legendary. The 78th fares better but still bleeds. Casualties are heavy. The Madras battalions lose hundreds. The 19th Light Dragoons and Madras cavalry take losses in their charges. Every unit engaged suffers. Maratha casualties are harder to ascertain. British officers report 1,200 dead and many more wounded. Modern historians estimate 6,000 total dead and wounded, 7 stands of colors captured, massive amounts of stores and ammunition, 98 guns. Most taken into British service afterward. Scindia and Bonsla are broken. Pullman surrenders after the battle. Remarkably, he re-enters British East India Company service in 1804 as a lieutenant colonel. A deserter, turned enemy commander, turned British officer again. War makes strange careers. The victory at Assaye, combined with Lake's successes in the north at Delhi and Laswari, forces the Maratha chiefs to terms. December 30th, 1803, Scindia signs the Treaty of Surji Anjangaon, cede his territories between the Ganges and Yamuna. Delhi Agra region, parts of Bundelkhand, Broch, districts of Gujarat, fort of Ahmadnagar. December 17th, 1803, Bhonsle signs the Treaty of Deogaon, gives up Cuttack in Odisha and territory west of the Warda River. The Second Anglo-Maratha War continues into 1805 with fighting against Holkar, but Assaye breaks the back of Maratha resistance in the Deccan. British control over central India is established. The path to complete dominance of the subcontinent opens. Wellesley later tells Stevenson he should not like to see again such a loss as sustained on September 23rd, even if attended by such a gain. In later life, he calls Assaye the bloodiest for the numbers that he ever saw. When asked decades after Waterloo what was the best thing he ever did in the way of fighting, the Duke of Wellington replies grimly with one word: Assaye. Says no more. What made the difference? Not superior firepower. The Marathas had 6 times the guns, not numbers. The Marathas had 5 times the men, not surprise. Pullman saw the crossing and redeployed efficiently. The difference was discipline under fire and willingness to close with cold steel. The bayonet charge at Assaye was not romantic. It was brutal mathematics. Artillery dominates at range. Cavalry is mobile but vulnerable to squares. Infantry with bayonets in close quarters breaks formations. Wellesley understood this. European tactics taught him. Indian experience proved it. When British and Madras infantry maintained cohesion under cannonade and charged home with bayonets, even well-trained regular battalions broke. But discipline alone does not explain it. The 78th Highlanders halted 50 yards from the guns, fired 1 volley, charged. The Maratha gunners stood their ground, died at their pieces, yet the infantry behind them fled. Why? Psychological shock. The sight of tall Highlanders in formation, marching through grapeshot without breaking, firing a perfect volley, then charging with 17-inch bayonets, was more than human nerves could stand. The Madras sepoys, moving in identical formation beside them. Added to the effect, this was not a mob. This was a machine, a killing machine that would not stop. The Maratha cavalry, 30 to 40,000 strong, did almost nothing, hovered at the flanks, threatened, never committed in mass. Why? Pullman could have sent them into the British rear after the 74th formed square, could have hit the exhausted British infantry during reorganization, did not. Possibly Scindia and Bhonsle's absence left command unclear. Possibly the irregular cavalry lacked cohesion for such an attack. Possibly seeing their own regular infantry flee destroyed morale. Whatever the reason, the cavalry that should have decided the battle watched it from the wings. The British cavalry, far smaller, charged twice. First time saved the 74th. Second time was repulsed, but they were used at critical moments, decisively. Wellesley's tactical sense put them where they mattered. Artillery tells the story in reverse. Maratha guns outnumbered British 6 to 1. Should have shattered the British advance, did inflict massive casualties, but once the British closed, the guns were useless. Gunners fought with pikes and bare hands, brave but futile. Infantry with bayonets killed them, captured the guns. Turned the artillery advantage into British loot. The ford changed everything. Pullman's defensive position on the Kaitna was sound. One ford, covered by guns. Any attack there would have been suicide. Wellesley's reconnaissance found the second ford, crossed beyond the Maratha left. Forced Pullman to redeploy 90 degrees. The new position protected flanks, but sacrificed depth, could not bring superior numbers to bear. The isthmus between the two rivers was only a mile wide. Pullman's 50,000 men could not all engage. Many were useless spectators. Terrain, tactics, discipline, leadership, all mattered. But the defining image is the bayonet charge. Men walking into cannon fire, closing to 50 yards, firing once, running the last distance with steel points forward, killing gunners at their pieces, driving infantry from positions, taking guns, holding ground, doing it again when gunners remanned the pieces. That is the Battle of Assaye. The sun set on the 23rd of September, 1803, not in a blaze of Indian glory, but in a haze of gun smoke and human suffering. The air over the plain of Assaye, thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of burnt powder, carried the sounds of the dying. Victory did not sound like trumpets. It sounded like the groans of wounded men and the desperate calls for water in a dozen languages. The battle was over. The dying had just begun. Arthur Wellesley, bone-weary and splattered with the mud and blood of the Kaitna River, sat on his horse, a replacement for the one shot from under him during the final cavalry charge. He surveyed the field his men had won. It was a butcher's yard. The neat lines and disciplined formations that had marched into the guns at 3 in the afternoon were now broken clumps of exhausted survivors, surrounded by heaps of the dead and dying. British redcoats, Highlander tartans now rendered a sodden brown, and the deep blue of the Madras cavalry lay intermingled with the white cotton of the Maratha dead. The 98 captured cannons stood silent, their bronze and iron barrels cooling in the evening air, many still surrounded by the bodies of the gunners who had refused to abandon them. For Wellesley, this was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of stark, terrifying calculation. He had won a victory against odds of more than 5 to 1. He had shattered a modern, European-trained army, but the cost was written in the blood of nearly 1,600 of his own men, a quarter of his force, lost in just 3 hours. He had no proper field hospital. He had 1 surgeon for every 10 officers, and perhaps 1 for every 200 men. Medical supplies were scarce. The nearest reinforcements under Colonel Stevenson were still a day's march away. The great mass of Maratha cavalry, tens of thousands of them, had melted into the dusk, but they had not been destroyed. They were still out there, a shadow on the horizon, capable of striking his crippled army at will. The first priority was not celebrating victory. It was survival. Water was the most urgent need. The Jua and Kaitna rivers were choked with bodies and blood, undrinkable. Parties were sent to dig wells, a desperate, slow process. The unwounded were put to work, not building fortifications, but collecting their fallen comrades. Lanterns flickered across the battlefield as sergeants called out names and tired soldiers turned over bodies, hoping to find a friend still breathing. The task of separating the living from the dead was grim and methodical. A man with a shattered leg might live. A man with a gut wound was left to die. There were not enough hands, not enough bandages, not enough opium to ease the pain. The state of the 74th Highlanders was a microcosm of the entire army's plight, of the nearly 500 men who had marched toward Assaye. Only 40 were now fit for duty. The rest were dead or wounded. They had formed their square behind a rampart of their own dead, and the sight of their shattered companies shocked even the most hardened veterans. Wellesley rode to them, his face a mask of grim resolve. He did not offer platitudes. He saw the cost of his ambition, the price of the aggression that had won him the day. The legend that the regiment was destroyed would spread through the army, but it was a legend born of awe, not fact. In the coming weeks, the resilience of these Highland soldiers would become as much a part of the Assaye story as the Bayonet Charge itself. Through the night, the work continued. Captured Maratha guns were secured. Ammunition wagons were inventoried. Pickets were posted, their nerves stretched taut, listening for the sound of hoofbeats in the darkness. Wellesley himself did not sleep for nearly 30 hours. He wrote his dispatch to his brother, the Governor-General, his language precise and understated, yet the scale of the slaughter was impossible to hide. He confessed the casualties were very great. He praised the discipline of his troops, singling out the 74th and 78th Highlanders and the steadfastness of the Madras battalions. But privately, to his confidants, his words were starker. This was a victory he never wanted to repeat. The gamble had paid off, but the dealer's price was cruelly high. When Colonel Stevenson's force arrived the next day, on September 24th, they were greeted not by a triumphant army, but by a sprawling hospital camp. Stevenson's men were fresh, and they took over the grim duties, burying the dead in mass graves, guarding the camp, and beginning the pursuit of the remnants of the Maratha infantry. For Wellesley's men, the Battle of Assaye was not truly over. It would continue for weeks in the fever tents and on the operating tables, where infection would claim nearly as many lives as Maratha cannonballs. The war, however, was far from over. Scindia and Ponsel's regular infantry had been broken, but their vast cavalry forces remained intact. Their spirit was wounded, but not extinguished. They still held powerful fortresses in the region, anchors for their power and symbols of their defiance. Wellesley knew that the victory at Assaye, however bloody and spectacular, was only the first act. To truly break the Maratha Confederacy in the Deccan, he had to deny them any chance to recover, any place to rally. He had to hunt them down and destroy them completely. After a few days of grim recovery, Wellesley divided his forces. He sent his sick and wounded back to British-held territory under heavy guard. He left a detachment to secure the captured guns and the battlefield. Then, with his remaining effective troops, now combined with Stevenson's division, he began the second phase of the campaign. The objective was twofold. First, to pursue and destroy the remaining forces of the Raja of Berar, Raghuje Bhonsle. Second, to reduce the great hill fortresses that dominated the region, most notably the formidable citadel of Gawilgur. The march north began in early October. The monsoon season was ending, but the rivers were still swollen, and the black cotton soil of the Deccan turned to a thick, clinging mud that exhausted the soldiers and the bullocks pulling the supply carts. The Maratha cavalry shadowed them constantly. They never offered a pitched battle. Not after the lesson of Assaye. Instead, they employed classic guerrilla tactics. They burned villages to deny the British forage. They attacked supply convoys. They picked off stragglers. It was a war of attrition, designed to wear Wellesley down, to make him bleed from 1,000 small cuts. Wellesley countered with relentless, driving pressure. He marched his men hard, covering ground at a speed that astonished his enemies. He lived as his men did, sleeping in his tent, eating the same rations, sharing their hardships. His intelligence network, built on local guides and spies known as hirkaras, was superb. He always seemed to know where the enemy was, where they were going. For weeks, the campaign was a game of cat and mouse played out across hundreds of square miles of central India. By late November, Wellesley's intelligence reported that Barnsley's army, having been reinforced by troops under Scindia's command, had regrouped and was preparing to make a stand. They were camped on a long plain near the village of Argaum, about 50 miles from the fortress of Gawilgar. Their force was considerable, a mix of Persian, Araber, and Maratha infantry, and a large body of cavalry. Their morale was fragile, but their position was strong, spread across a front of nearly 5 miles, with their left flank anchored on Argaum and their right on a series of treacherous ravines. On the afternoon of November 29th, 1803, Wellesley's army came upon them. The British and Indian troops had just completed a grueling march of 26 miles under a hot sun. They were exhausted, thirsty, and caked in dust. As they deployed from marching columns into lines of battle, the strain began to show. This was not the same army that had marched so steadily into the guns at Assaye. The memory of that slaughter was fresh. The men were battle-weary. Then, something happened that had not happened at Assaye. Discipline cracked. As the Maratha cannons opened fire, several sepoy battalions on the British right flank, men who had fought bravely 2 months prior, suddenly panicked. They broke ranks and began to fall back in confusion. The officers screamed orders, drew their swords, and tried to stem the rout, but the fear was contagious. A gap opened in Wellesley's line. For a moment, the entire British position was on the verge of collapse. If the Maratha cavalry had charged then, the war in the Deccan might have had a very different ending. Wellesley, seeing the crisis unfold, acted instantly. He galloped into the midst of the retreating sepoys, his voice cutting through the noise and confusion. He was not a man given to theatrics, but his presence was electric. With his staff officers, he personally rallied the men, grabbing hold of their jackets, turning them back toward the enemy, restoring order through sheer force of will. The line stabilized. The moment of panic passed. It was a demonstration of leadership as critical as any tactical decision he had ever made. With the line reformed, Wellesley ordered the general advance. The 74th and 78th Highlanders, their ranks refilled with convalesced wounded from Assaye and a handful of replacements, were once again on the left of the line. They advanced with the same grim determination they had shown before, their bayonets glistening in the late afternoon sun. The rest of the infantry, their confidence restored, moved with them. The Battle of Argaum was not a repeat of Assaye's brutal or close-quarters slugging match. The Maratha army, having witnessed the initial wavering of the British line, seemed to lose its nerve when the advance came on steady and unbroken. Their artillery fire was less effective, their infantry less resolute. A unit of Persian mercenaries, famed for their ferocity, charged the Highlanders. They were met with a single, devastating volley at 50 paces, and then a bayonet charge that shattered them completely. The rest of the Maratha lines saw this, and their will to fight evaporated. What began as a retreat quickly turned into a rout. The British cavalry, which had played a crucial but costly role at Assaye, now had its moment. They were unleashed on the fleeing Marathas, cutting them down as they ran, turning the defeat into a catastrophe for Barnsley. The battle was over by nightfall. The British casualties were light this time, just over 300 killed and wounded. The Maratha losses were in the thousands, and they lost all their cannon and baggage. The victory was complete. Argaum had been the echo of Assaye, a final confirmation that no Maratha army in the field could stand against Wellesley's disciplined machine. But one task remained. High on a mountain ridge in the Satpura range stood the fortress of Gawilgar. It was Barnsley's bastion, a place of refuge and a symbol of his power. It was considered impregnable. The fortress was a complex of 2 forts, an inner and an outer, protected by a series of ravines and sheer cliffs. The main approach from the south was guarded by 5 separate gates, one behind the other, up a steep and winding path. The northern face was a sheer cliff face, believed to be completely inaccessible. Wellesley knew that as long as Gawilgar stood, the war would not be over. He laid siege to it in early December. The logistical challenge was immense. The British siege guns, heavy 24 and 18-pounder cannons, had to be dragged for miles over mountains and across ravines by teams of elephants and hundreds of men. For 12 days, in punishing labor, his soldiers and engineers built roads where there were none and constructed batteries on precarious ledges overlooking the fort's northern walls. Wellesley had decided to attack the supposedly inaccessible northern front, while making a loud, demonstrative feint against the heavily fortified southern gates to distract the garrison. On December 15th, 1803, the siege batteries opened fire. For 2 days, they pounded a section of the outer wall on the northern face, slowly creating a breach. At 10 in the morning on the 15th, the assault began. Colonel Stevenson's division led the main attack on the northern breach, while another force created a diversion in the south. The honor of leading the assault, the so-called Forlorn Hope, fell to a flank company of the 94th Regiment. They scrambled up the rubble of the breach under a hail of musket fire, arrows, and rocks. They fought their way into the outer fort, followed closely by the rest of the assault column. The fighting was hand-to-hand, desperate and brutal, in the narrow laneways and courtyards. The garrison, though outnumbered, fought with incredible bravery. But the true challenge was the inner fort. Its walls were untouched, its gate barred. The assault seemed to have stalled. The British were trapped between the outer and inner walls, taking casualties from the ramparts above. It was then that Captain Campbell of the 94th Regiment found a way. He discovered a secondary gate, the western gate, and led a small party to scale the wall with ladders. They fought their way to the gate, opened it from the inside, and allowed the main force to pour into the heart of the fortress. The remaining defenders were overwhelmed. The fort was taken. The last bastion of the Rajah of Berar had fallen. The fall of Gawilgur, coming so soon after the disaster at Argaum, broke the will of the Maratha chiefs. 2 days later, on December 17th, 1803, a demoralized Raghuji Bhonsle signed the Treaty of Deogaon. He ceded vast territories to the British East India Company and agreed to host a British resident at his court, effectively becoming a client state. Less than 2 weeks after that, on December 30th, Daulat Rao Scindia, seeing his main ally defeated and his own armies shattered at Assaye in the south and Laswari in the north, also came to terms. He signed the Treaty of Surji Anjangaon, relinquishing huge tracts of land, including the region around Delhi and Agra. In a single Emri Empires whirlwind campaign of less than 5 months, Arthur Wellesley had broken the back of the most powerful indigenous force in India. He had marched hundreds of miles, won 2 decisive pitched battles against overwhelming odds, and stormed an impregnable fortress. The Second Anglo-Maratha War would sputter on against another chief, Yashwant Rao Holkar, for another 2 years. But the decisive blow had been struck here in the Deccan between September and December of 1803. The question remains, why did Wellesley, decades later, after a career that saw him defeat the finest marshals of Napoleon and finally the Emperor himself at Waterloo, still call Assaye the greatest thing he ever did? It was not his most tactically perfect battle. Argaum was a cleaner victory. It was not his most technically brilliant operation. The siege of Gawilgur was a masterpiece of engineering and logistics. He chose Assaye because it was the moment of supreme risk. It was the moment when everything was on the line. At Assaye, he was not the famous Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, a figure of immense prestige. He was a young general, his reputation built on family connections as much as talent, leading a tiny army deep in hostile territory. He made a decision to attack a force 5 times his size, a decision that every conventional military textbook would have condemned as reckless. He threw the dice, and he won. But he saw, in the 3 hours of carnage that followed, the razor-thin margin between a glorious victory that would make his name and an utter annihilation that would have ended his career and perhaps British ambitions in the Deccan. The battle was won not by clever tactics alone, but by the sheer, stubborn, disciplined courage of the infantry, both British and Indian, who marched into a storm of iron and did not break. It was won by men who walked forward when everything screamed at them to run. It was that human element, that supreme test of nerve and discipline against the terror of massed artillery, that burned Assaye into his memory. Waterloo was a grander affair, a clash of empires on a European stage, but Assaye was elemental. It was blood and steel and mud and the will of one man pitted against 100 guns. And in the end, that is what he remembered most. The bloodiest fight he ever saw, the one that made him, the one that almost broke him, the one he simply called Assaye,